So multiple dialogues handle different parts of a form simultaneously. For example, multiple dialogues really just mean that I've got multiple dialogue instructions or interactive instructions that we've talked about before. Inputs, display arrays, input arrays, construct, the menu statement, all of those are examples of dialogue instructions or interactive instructions. And multiple dialogues just means that we have more than one of these dialogue instructions that are bound together inside of kind of a parent dialogue block. And any subdialogue, that's how we refer to a dialogue when they're bundled inside this parent dialogue instruction. We think of them as subdialogs at that point. So any subdialogues that are nested within this parent dialogue are active at the same time. So active in parallel, you could think. So I could have a form that has multiple parts to it that are controlled by, for example, an input array, and another part of the form controlled by a display array. And the user can move between those different parts of the form that are controlled by these different dialogue instructions freely, without having to accept or cancel or go through everything in a sequential manner to get there. So that's the idea behind multiple dialogues, to be able to move around freely in the form between these different sub-dialogue controlled form structures. So here's an example of an application that uses multiple dialogues. If you've worked with or explored the Office Store application, it's one of the sample applications that comes with the software. If you've played with that at all, it gives you some really good examples of multiple dialogues. So this is the Orders application in that Office Store project. And here we've got two parts to this form. It's a fairly complex form. And we've got part of the form here that's controlled by an input subdialog, and then another part of the form down here at the bottom that's controlled by an input array dialog. But the user can move around between those parts of the form to look at items and scroll, for example, without having to go through these other parts of the forms sequentially and using accept and cancel to get out of them. We've got another example here that we're using for class that's a simpler example. Have to wake it up, it looks like. Here we go. Close that. Here's an application called mDialogs that you'll be working with in your lab, so you'll be doing the same type of thing. But the idea here is if I've just got two different display arrays in this case, and it's pretty clear which, there's a display array on the left and a display array on the right-hand side. But I can move between these two dialogues, these two sub-dialogues freely without having to accept or cancel one part of the form, out of one part of the form to move into the other. So I can just bounce back and forth. I can go over here and delete and then pop right over here. The only thing I have to really do is if I do an insert, for example, I do have to accept or cancel out of my insert. But that's to do things like perform field validation and that type of thing. So that's a normal part of an insert. But otherwise, I can just move back and forth. If I don't change anything or make any modifications, I can do that with my multiple dialogues. So that's an application you'll be working with this afternoon, providing everything's working for you now. So just to take a look at this, here we've got our main up here at the top where we're just defining our two different arrays that we use for our lists, loading up the arrays here with this for loop. And then down here is our multiple dialog statements. Let's see if I can pull that down a little bit so you can see the whole thing, or at least a good part of it. So right up here, we implement multiple dialogs with another interactive instruction called the dialog instruction. So we see that here, and you can think of it as a parent dialogue or a parent interactive instruction. So from all the way from where you define the dialogue statement up here on line 29 in this example, all the way down here to line 58 where we have the end dialogue, any subdialogue like this display array here on line 31, here's another display array on line 43, these are now subdialogues that are under the control of this parent dialogue instruction. They're all in this dialogue block, you could say. So any subdialogue, display array, input, construct statement, anything that's within that overarching dialogue statement between the dialogue and the end dialogue is going to be active at the same time. So these two display arrays are both active, and that's the reason we can hop back and forth between those two parts of the form so freely. So here it's talking about that dialogue block that we just looked at. So we had the dialogue, and then we had the end dialogue, and of course you've got some additional clauses and options, attributes that you can use with that dialogue block. I believe we saw one of these. I didn't point it out, but you've got the option to use attributes with the dialogue statement. Let me go back real quickly and show you that. Right, so we use this unbuffered attribute with this dialogue instruction. So this parent dialogue instruction up here is using the unbuffered attribute at that level, which means that all of these subdialogues, these two display arrays, are going to inherit that attribute. So I could specify the unbuffered attribute for each individual subdialogue if I wanted to, but I also now have the ability to specify that all the subdialogues inherit this unbuffered attribute. So it saves me a little time in programming that way. So you've got some options there, like this field order form, unbuffered, whoops. And you've also got some new control blocks. You're familiar with some of the control blocks that we can use to manage what happens inside of an interactive instruction. We've got things like before field, after field, that type of thing. Well, now we have an attribute or control block for dialogues called before dialogue and after dialogue. And of course, those are unique to this special dialogue block. That's the only place that you can use those. So you would do things with this before dialogue, for example, to initialize perhaps some action settings, disable actions, enable some actions, maybe disable fields, enable fields before entering the dialogue block. And I've got a good example of that as well that I'll show you in just a minute. But first we'll look at these programming steps. Everything you see here in the programming steps you've seen before when you're working with just these regular dialogue instructions, like a display array, for example. You already know that you create a form with your screen records or screen arrays, depending on what you're working with. You have to define your program variables, records, and arrays. Open and display your form, fill your program variables with data. All of that is the same steps that you would go through working with just a regular interactive instruction. The part that's different is this step 5. Implement the dialogue instruction block to handle interaction and define the subdialogues. So that's the first new step that we're learning here with this new dialogue instruction. And again, we do have two new control blocks. We have the before dialogue and the after dialogue that we saw in the previous slide. And then we need to somehow either accept or cancel to exit out of the dialogue to go on to the next line of executable code. And typically the way you do that is with an accept dialogue, like on action accept, so that the user triggers the accept action by clicking OK, for example, and then on action accept, you could say accept dialog, and that does all the things that you would expect. Dialog validation, for example, and then moves on down to the end of the dialog block. It doesn't process any additional lines of code inside that dialog block once you click accept and we use this accept dialog statement. And the same thing is true as well if you cancel. Like let's say we allow the user to cancel out of the dialog, we typically would say on action cancel, exit dialog. Right? We don't want to accept the dialog. We don't want to do any validation at that point. We want to just exit out of the dialog and then go down to the next line of executable code. So here's an example very similar to the one I just showed you there from your lab for this afternoon, but it's shortened a bit so that it'll all fit on one slide. So we have our kind of overarching or our parent dialog block here, dialog in dialog. And again, we can use this unbuffered attribute with our dialog statements so that all of our subdialogs inherit that attribute as well. And then here's our first display array, our first subdialog in our multiple dialog block, and then here's our second subdialog. Now you can certainly have more than two subdialogs, but you have to have at least two, right, to have multiple dialogs. So here we're just displaying an array, and here we're displaying another array. And one thing I want to point out with this example is this idea that we have subdialog level actions and then we have dialog level actions. So this on action close down here would be a dialog level action. Notice that it's outside of our subdialog blocks. Right? So there's a subdialog display array in display. Here's another one, display array in display. But the on action clause is outside of the display array. So that means that it's an action available to the dialog. It's a dialog level action. So it doesn't matter which one of these subdialogs is active, right? The user could be bouncing around between these two different subdialogs, but the close action is available in either case, regardless. And when he selects that, then it's going to close basically close the dialog or exit the dialog. And here's our exit dialog statement that we're using to exit out of the dialog. So that'll move us right down to the end of the dialog block and execute the next line of executable code. So you're familiar with subdialogs from the regular dialog instructions like display array or input array. So these should be familiar to you from learning about these interactive instructions. We've got before and after input, before, after construct control blocks, before display, after display, and so on. And again, we've got a few new ones here with this dialog control block. We've got one that we want to have code executed before the user enters the first subdialog, and then you also have an after dialog control block that you can use that is processed after the dialog, after the last line in the dialog statement, but before the next line of executable code is processed. Let me show you one of those before we pop over into these default action views. Probably to find that, this is something we'll look at later this morning. This is an application to enable something called multiple row select, but it makes a good example. So notice that when I ran this application, I've got some buttons over here that are active, cancel, MRS, insert, but notice I've got a couple of buttons here in the middle between these two lists that are grayed out or disabled. So let me show you an example of that. So here's our dialog statement for this application. It's got a display array and another display array in it for those two lists that we saw. And then right here is a before dialog, an example of the before dialog block that we just talked about in the previous slide. So before it actually enters the first display array or starts executing the code in the display array, it's going to execute the code in this before dialog block. So the first thing it's doing here is calling a function called disable MRS actions, and it's passing it a reference to the current dialog. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But there's an example of the before dialog control block. And here is on action cancel. This is a dialog level action, right? It's outside of our subdialog block, display array, in display. And then here's our on action cancel out here. So this is a dialog level action. Just to see that. So it doesn't matter where I'm at, which subdialog I'm working in. I've got this cancel option, and I can trigger that from within any subdialog because it's out here at this level. On action cancel is after all the subdialog blocks. Here's an example of that on action close, and again it's an action that's at the dialog level because it's not inside any of these subdialog blocks. So if I click close, then it also exits the dialog. And if there was anything else, it would go down to the next line of executable code at that point. In this case, there's not anything else, so it just exits the application. So here we're looking at default actions for the dialog instruction. Really, these default actions are dependent on the subdialogs. Like, for example, the example we just looked at was 2 display arrays. So we would expect to see default actions and default actions views for display array, and that's what you get. So it doesn't really, I think, correlate directly back to the dialog instruction, that new dialog block we're looking at. It's tied back to the subdialogs that are nested within the dialog instruction. So this should not be anything strange or new, right? You've seen this before where you get these default actions and default action views for insert, append, delete, update, and so on for display array, for example. When you use the modification triggers that we learned about yesterday, you would see these default actions and default action views. So nothing new about that part. You might also see next row, previous row, first row, last row. You see those only if you are displaying a list, but your screen record that you've defined only allows one row to be shown at a time. And then since it can't show you the scroll bar like we normally would see for a large list, it has these options, or buttons typically, for these options so that you can click through a list. But again, you typically don't see that unless you have deliberately used a screen record that only shows one row. You can actually identify your subdialogs by name, and there's a few cases when you'd need to do that. So I've set you up a lab this afternoon so that you can see some of the reasons that you might care about identifying subdialogs in your code. So subdialog identifiers are needed for some of the dialog instructions. Some of our methods that we have with these built-in classes, the ui.Dialog class, requires you to specify the subdialog. If we have actions, for example, in multiple subdialogs that have the same name, that way we can identify which subdialog action we want that method to act upon. So that's the reason you might want to do that. For example, I've got these 2 display arrays in our example here, and you can see that they have the same actions. Now we're using modification triggers, but it's the same concept. I've got insert, I've got delete, I've got append, I've got update. I've got that in the first display array, and I've got all of that in the second display array as well. And of course these actions have the same name. So if I wanted to use one of these built-in class methods and only affect let's say, an action in the second display array, the second subdialog, then I need some way to reference that subdialog action so that the method is only acting on that one action, that one subdialog action, and not the other subdialog. So that's the reasoning behind it. You might have duplicated names for your actions when you're working with multiple dialogues, and being able to identify the action that you're talking about by specifying the subdialog name can be real important. So how do we do that? How do we identify these subdialogs by name? Well, it depends on the type of subdialog you're working with. If you're working with an input array or a display array, then the subdialogs are already identified with the screen record name. So you don't have to give it a name. Instead, you just use the name of the screen record to identify it. So this action here in this display array, the full name for that action is going to be the screen record name, right, the screen array name, dot, and then the name of the action. So this guy could actually be called sr_ord.check. So if there's some, let's say you wanted to go in and make this action disabled, right, deactivate the action, so to speak, so that it's grayed out, then you could name it by name by calling it sr_ord.check and use the ui.Dialog method, built-in method, to disable it using that name. And that way it'll only disable this subdialog's check action, but not the other display array's check action. It's a little different when you're working with input or construct. So for input and construct, we don't identify the subdialog by the screen record. Instead, you give it a name with an attribute clause. So attributes, name, equal, and then you just make up a name. And then from that point on, you can reference the actions in that subdialog by this name that you've given it. In this case, account.check. So that's a way to identify actions by name. And this is just another reminder of why that might be important. Actions can be defined at 3 different levels in a dialog instruction. So you can see that if you were using, let's say, some of these special class methods to go in and manipulate actions, disable them, enable them, hide them, show them, it might be very important for you to specify exactly which level of action you're talking about that has the same name. So there's 3 different levels that you can actually have these actions. And of course the name will be different depending on the level. So this one is showing you an state field, right? They've got an on-action zoom defined at the field level. So input by name, and notice it's an input, so we give our subdialog a name here with this attributes clause. So we're calling it account, so that's the name of the subdialog, the input. And then on action zoom in field state. So that's a field level action. So the name of this action, if I wanted to qualify the name, would be, let's see, it would be account.state.zoom. That's hard for me to work through, right? So I have to give it the name of the subdialog, which is account. Give it the name of the field, since it's a field level action, which is state, and then of course the name of the action itself is zoom. So account.state.zoom. And then here is a subdialog level action down here. So notice we're not using this in-field qualifier. So this is just the sub-level. So on action zoom, you could specify as account.zoom in that case. And then the runtime system would know which action you were wanting to manipulate. And then finally, here we've ended the subdialog. Here's the end input. And now we have another on action zoom. And we talked about this in the previous slide or so. This is our dialog level actions. So dialog level actions, you just use the simple name. So the name of that action is just zoom. So if you say use a ui.Dialog method to hide the action, you would just call it zoom, and that's the level that it would apply that method to. So here's some examples of using these qualified names for actions. So we've got our dialogs here. Here's our parent dialog statement up at the top, and it goes on too far for us to see the end dialog, but it's down here somewhere. And then here's our first subdialog. It's a display array, and then here's our second subdialog. And this is the example we were looking at in the actual code a few minutes ago, so this should be pretty familiar to you. I saw this on action MRS, so that comes straight out of that application that I used for a demo a minute ago. So here is this on action MRS. So if the user clicks the MRS button, so there's a button called MRS, it's going to call a function called MRS setup and pass it a reference to the current dialog. We'll talk more about this passing a dialog as a reference in just a minute. So down here is the function MRS setup. It's got a variable here defined as a ui.Dialog object. So this has our reference now to the current dialog as this variable D. And then we're using one of these built-in class methods, this ui.Dialog.setActionHidden method. And notice we're using the qualified name, or we'll say the fully qualified name for that action insert. So SR1, this is a display array. So if you remember, the name for the subdialogs for display array and input array is the name of the screen record, the screen array. So it's SR_1 is the name of the screen record dot insert. So that tells us that the action that we want to hide is the action associated with this first display array subdialog that has SR_1 for the name of its screen record. So here it's talking about ending the dialog. We've seen a few examples already of the accept dialog and exit dialog statement, but it's pointing out too that the dialog instruction block doesn't use that int flag globally defined variable, right? That predefined global variable. And it also doesn't create default actions for accept and cancel at the dialog level. So that means you have to do it yourself. So you can use this on action accept or on action cancel to handle that yourself instead of getting defaults like we're accustomed to getting. And usually if we say on action accept, we use the accept dialog statement with that clause to do dialog validation or field validation. And then once it does the field validation, providing there's no problems, then it goes on down to the end of the dialog and executes the first line of executable code after the dialog statement. And likewise, if the user cancels, we typically combine that with an exit dialog statement that does not do any type of validation, and again just exit out of the dialog statement and goes down to the next line of executable code. We've also got a continue dialog statement. So again, you can just, instead of exiting the dialog, you can just continue the dialog. And then there's also a next field so that you can control the field that it moves to. So here's some example code, accept or exit dialog. And again, usually the accept dialog, you'll typically see on action accept for that. But in this case, this is an actual code excerpt from the Office Store project that I found. On action append, they're doing some things and then they're accepting the dialog. And of course that does validation and then goes on down to the next line of code. Now if we have an after dialog control block down here, then of course the except dialog would go down and execute the code in the after dialog statement. So it would still do that, but then it would go on down to the next line of executable code. And here's an example of on-action cancel, doing a bunch of things here, and then exiting the dialog. And again, it's not going to execute any more lines of code inside that dialog block. It's going to exit out and start with the first line after the dialog instruction. So here we're finally getting into some of these special ui.Dialog.class methods that we can use to manipulate elements in the user interface controlled by these dialogs, these subdialogs. So here we've got, grab my highlighter, this predefined keyword dialog is a shortcut. So instead of having to define a variable of type of type dialog, right, a dialog object, instead of having to do that, you can just get a reference to the current dialog with this special keyword, predefined keyword. Now we do have a method, a class method, that you can use to get a reference to the current dialog object if you want to use it, but we also have this shortcut, this keyword dialog. So you can only use it, this keyword that you see here called DIALOG.setSelection yada yada, you can only use that inside of the dialog block. So if you try to use the dialog keyword outside of a dialog block, you get a compile error or compiler error. So in the cases where you want to reference the current dialog outside of the dialog block, you do have to define variables and pass the reference to the current dialog outside to a function. And then of course inside that function you have to define your variables of type ui.Dialog. But if you're working within the dialog block, you can just use this method right here called DIALOG.setSelection and then pass it your information. We'll see that here in just a minute. That's talking about multiple row select, and we have a whole section on that here a little later in the chapter. So passing the dialog object to a function. So we just mentioned that you can't use the dialog keyword outside of the dialog block, right? Dialog in dialog. But what you can do is pass the reference to the current dialog to a function outside the dialog block, like we see here. Right, so we're calling a function called mrsSetup. Here we're using the dialog keyword to pass a reference to this current dialog to that function. And then here inside the function we are defining a variable of type ui.Dialog, and now we have a reference to that dialog with this variable d. So d.setSelectionMode sr1, 1. So basically that's turning on multiple row select, which we'll learn about here in just a few minutes. But it makes a good example. So here is the class method I just mentioned a minute ago. You do have an option here to use a class method to get a reference to the current dialog object instead of using the keyword. There might be cases when that's a better way to do it. So right here we're defining our variable of type ui.Dialog, and then here we're assigning a reference to the current dialog to that variable with this ui.Dialog.getCurrent class method. And then right here we're using that reference to the current dialog to manipulate a field. Set field active, this is the name of the form field, is name, and setting it to false says I'm going to deactivate, right, disable this form so that it's grayed out and the user can't work with that form field. We just saw at the dialog level a few minutes ago that we had the attributes clause that we could use at the dialog level to set the unbuffered attribute for all the subdialogs? Well, here's another way to do it. We've got this ui.Dialog method, class method, set default unbuffered to true. So that's a method that you can use instead of using the attributes clause with the unbuffered attribute. You can use this method instead. So either one of those methods works. If you wanted to, you could use this method to set the unbuffered mode to true and then to false and true again if you wanted to, multiple times during the program execution. And here's some object methods. We've got object methods with this special dialog class to manage arrays. I think we'll see some of those here in a minute. Support multiple row selection. I know we have a section on that here in a minute, so you'll see all these different methods to manage multiple row selection. Control behavior of the interactive instruction. Find the current form or form item that has the focus. Manage and interact with form fields. We saw an example of that on the previous page. Can use that to hide form fields or disable form fields. And we've also got methods to enable and disable actions. We saw an example of that a few minutes ago as well. So here's some examples of some of these object methods. So enabling and disabled actions, we've got a special method, setActionActive, for that. So here's a function in that same application we was looking at just a few minutes ago. So here we have, outside of this function, we've used either the keyword and got a reference to the current dialog that way, or we've used that special class method that we just saw to get a reference to the current dialog. And we've called this function and passed that reference to the current dialog to the function. So here in the function, we have our variable defined as type ui.Dialog object. And here we're using this reference to the current dialog with the setActionActive method. So there's an action called move1, and 0 means that we're actually making it disabled, right? We're disabling that action. Now it still shows up, but it's just grayed out, right? The user can see that it's there, but he can't manipulate or press the button, for example. And then the same thing here for another button called move2. We're disabling that button as well. And then down here, handling default action view visibility with setActionHidden. I don't know if you remember, but yesterday, one of the topics from yesterday was to talk about ways to manage action view visibility. And we talked about two different ways to do that yesterday. One was doing that in the action defaults file, right, the .4ad file. So we had an attribute there that we could specify for an individual action, and we could specify whether the default view was hidden or not hidden. So that was, I'll review that here in just a second, but we could do that in the action default file. And the other way we talked about being able to do that was to do it at the form level. If we do it at the form level, we would add an action default section to the form or list to the form, then add the action to it, and then in the properties for that action, there's the option there to show or hide the action view by default. So that's what we learned yesterday. We learned two different methods of how to handle default action view visibility, whether or not they actually show up by default. Now here's the third method here using one of these special ui.Dialog class methods. So here again we've got a reference to the current dialog outside this function. We've called the function and passed in that reference. And in here inside the function we have a ui.Dialog variable configured. So we're assigning this reference to the current dialog to this variable D. And then we can use the setActionHidden. And here notice that we're using the qualified names for these actions, right? The subdialog name, SR_1. So this is a display array, right, or an input array, but I think it's a display array since it's our example. SR_1, remember, is the screen record name for that display array. And we use that to qualify the action name so that it knows which action to hide. So setting it to 1, passing in a 1 with that method is basically saying it's true. It's a Boolean type thing. So set action hidden, setting it to 1 hides the action. If we wanted to unhide it, we run the same command, but we pass it as 0. And we're doing the same thing here for the second display array, sr_2, and we've got some actions here, insert and delete, that we're hiding. And one more, MRS. There's an action called MRS, and we're hiding that as well. So there's some additional methods of how to handle default action view visibility. 3 different methods that we've talked about. We've got the action defaults file, we've got the action defaults section of the form, and now we're talking about the special class method. So here's some additional ui.Dialog methods, just so that you get an idea. And again, you can always look these up in the documentation. This is just more or less to make you familiar with the idea that there's a lot of different methods that you can use to manipulate different elements of the user interface. So getCurrentItem returns the current item, whatever that is on the form. It could be a field, it could be a list, like a display array, a list from a display array, or it could be an action, whatever the current item is. Here's the method to get a reference to the current form, getForm. I don't know if you remember from the Genero Language Basics class, the ui.Form class is one of the few classes I can think of that doesn't have its own method to get a reference to the current object, the current form. So you actually have to use either a ui.Window method or this ui.Dialog method to get a reference to the current form. So it's an interesting example. But this is a method you can use to get a reference to the current form. And you cannot do that with a ui.Form class method. getFieldBuffer returns the current input buffer of the field you specify when you use that method. This getFieldTouched is something you can use to see if a field has been touched by the user, right? If he's parsed through that field or made changes to that field, it will set the touched flag to true, and you can see if it's been touched. You don't necessarily know if it's been manipulated, but you can tell that it's been touched by using this method. This specifies the next field that you want to have the focus, so you can control, again, the behavior of the interface when the user is working within it. You can specify which field he moves to next programmatically, not just at the form level. setFieldActive enables and disables the fields that you specify. And setFieldTouched is a way that you can manipulate the touched flag of a field and cause it to be set to touched. And these are some ui.Dialog methods to manage arrays. I think probably some of these you've seen with the previous class. If you had the Genero Language Basics class, we talk about all kinds of methods to manage arrays, so these might be familiar to you. Just to go through them quickly, again, you can always read the documentation to get the details, but we've got methods to append and delete rows, to delete all rows in the list, to get the total number of rows in the list, get the current row, insert a row. For paged mode, if you remember, there's two different ways that you can display an array. You can just display the full list all at once, or you can use this paged mode, which is more efficient for large lists. So again, it only displays the rows of what they call a page at a time. Remember, page is based on the amount of viewable space in the form at that time. So if the user stretches a window or scrolls, that frees up available space and it fetches an additional page of rows. So that's used with page mode. We've got a set current row method that you can use to change the row designated as current in the list. And then we've got some set cell attributes options to define decoration attributes, things like colors and that type of thing for the list. If you use the set cell attributes, it's just for regular dialog instructions, not multiple dialogs. If you're working with multiple dialogs, we have this set array attributes method that you can use instead. All right, so that's an overview of multiple dialogs and some of the special ui.Dialog built-in class methods. And we'll see some more of those here with this multiple row select, or at least we'll revisit some of them here. So here we're talking about multiple row selection. By default, when you are working with a list and the user selects values or selects rows from the list, he's only allowed to select a single row at a time. But we have something called multiple row select that you can turn on for a list. Actually, it's basically turning it on at kind of the table level. You can turn it on, and that allows the user to select multiple rows at the same time. And it uses all the typical ergonomics that you're probably already familiar with, right, from working with other applications. I can use the control key to select rows that are not sequentially placed, and I can use the shift key for selecting rows in a sequential fashion. To use multiple row select, there's a few concepts that you have to be aware of or to consider before you start looking at it. When we're working with regular dialogs, regular interactive instructions, we can only select, without multiple row select enabled, we can only select one row at a time, and that row is automatically the current row. Right? So the current row is also the selected row. But when you start working with multiple row select, then the current row may or may not be selected, and the selected rows may or may not be the current row. So first thing, I guess, is to know that there's two different concepts here. We've got selected row versus the current row. Selected rows, by default, have a blue background. Now, of course, that's all something you can change with styles and that type of thing, but by default, they'll typically have a blue background. The current row has a dotted line, and it's hard to see, but it looks like right now the state field right now is the selected field. It looks like a dotted line, although it's very difficult to see in this particular screenshot. So two different concepts there. So we have special methods with this kind of series of methods that we use to handle multiple row select so that you can query a value in the list to see if it's selected or not. So we'll see that in just a minute. So the first method we look at here is the method we use to actually enable or disable this ability to select multiple rows. So it's called setSelectionModel, and again you pass it the name of the screen record, the screen array in this case, and then you set it to 1 if you want to enable multiple row select for that screen record, that display array. So in this case it looks like we're turning on multiple row select for both of these lists, right, for both of these display arrays by specifying the screen record or the screen array for that. So here's some example code. Here's our dialog statement. And then here we have our two subdialogs. We have these two display arrays to create our list that we saw in the screenshot a minute ago. We've got array A and array B. And of course SR1 is our screen record or our screen array for the first display array, and SR_2 is our screen record for the second display array. So here we're saying if the user triggers this MRS action, we have a button out there named MRS, then we're going to call this function called MRS setup, pass it a reference to the current dialog, and then in this special MRS setup function, we're going to use the setSelectionModel method we just discussed to turn on multiple row select for these two display arrays by specifying the name of the screen record that they display to. So here we're referring back to this idea that we need to be able to figure out whether or not a row has been selected or not, because we can't say that the current row is the selected row with multiple row select. So the way we do that is with this special method, isRowSelected, and we typically use that with some sort of flow control. Like in this case, we've got a for loop that we're using to parse through all these different elements in the list to see if they have their flag set, right? Their selection flag set. So that's what it's checking for. And just to kind of walk through this, the way this particular application is working is you can select rows or select rows over here in one list, like let's say the left-hand side, and then you can use these redirectional arrows over here to move the selected rows over to the other list. So that's what we're seeing here. So in the code, we're checking to see if a row has been selected, and if it has been selected, then we're appending rows to the other list, and then we're copying the contents of the selected rows over to the second list, and then we're deleting those rows from the original list. So that's what this for loop is doing. But it's using this isRowSelected to check the status of a row to see if that selection flag's been set. And if it's been set, then at that point it's going to append to the other list and delete from the current list. You also have one more method to work with multiple row select, and that's this setSelectionRange. This is handy for cases where, let's say you've got the double arrows that are traditionally used like we see here. Back up for just a second. These little double arrows typically mean I want to copy all rows to the right or all rows to the left. So this setSelectionRange is handy for that because you can specify programmatically. The user doesn't have to go in and select each row to set the selection flag. You can just do it programmatically with this method. So that's what we're doing here, called DIALOG.setSelection and then we're specifying this is for the specific display array, the specific list that we're wanting to work with, and we're doing that by specifying again the screen record name. And this is our range, so from the first row to the nth row. And the -1 specifies beginning to the end, or the end, right? So 1 is the beginning, -1 would be the end of the list. And then the 1, of course, enables the row to be selected, or it tells it to set the flag selected as selected. And then you've got this option here to unselect the range of rows. Let's say they change their mind. We can just change it to 0 instead of 1, and that deselects all the rows in that range. So 1 or 0, just a toggle back and forth. All right, so that takes care of the lecture part. Let's just take a look at that application for a minute. So here's this mDialog's MRS. And just for grins, I think I'm going to use the debugger for that so that you can maybe follow along a bit better and see some of this code that we've been talking about. Kind of have to keep popping it up here. But here we are at the dialog statement. So at this point we've gone in and we have defined our arrays and loaded our arrays, and now we're sitting here at this first dialog instruction block. So if I click Next over here in my debug toolbar, notice that before we actually enter the dialog block and go into this first display array statement, this application has a before dialog control block defined. And this before dialog control block has some code to call a function so that we can set up the form to look like we want it to look when the user first sees it. So we've got a function here we're calling called disable MRS actions, and we're passing it a reference to this current dialog. At this point it's just the overarching dialog block. So if we go down and look at that, let me step into that function here, step into. Here's this function that we're calling. We've passed it a reference here to the current dialog. So notice we're using some of these special methods that we've just discussed. So we're trying to disable multiple row select actions at this point so that the user doesn't have the option to move stuff back and forth yet. We want him to specify that he wants to use multiple row select before we allow him to use these actions. So we're using the special setActionActive method to disable the move 1 and move 2 actions. That's the first two lines here, so that they're grayed out. So well, you won't be able to really see that just yet. Let me pop down here a little further. There we go. So now you can see it. I've moved past those two lines. So what we did just now was use these two lines of code with the setActionActive method to disable. This is the move 1 action, or at least the action view for move 1 is this right arrow, and move 2 is this left arrow. So by doing that, they're grayed out, and as the user, I'm not allowed to select those right now because they're disabled. What the application wants me to do is click on this MRS option, this MRS button over here on the right. So let me do that just for fun. So when I clicked on that button, it triggered the MRS action that's associated with that button. So here's my on action MRS, and I'm going to call a function now called MRS setup, and again pass it a reference to this current dialog. So let's go take a look at that. Now this could have been done a lot more elegantly, for lack of a better word, but this is very simple to read. So here's the function, and we're getting it set up so that the user can tinker around with this multiple row select feature. So first thing is we're turning on multiple row select with the first two lines. So here we're turning it on for the first display array by specifying the screen array for it, and then the second line is turning on multiple row select for the second array, SR2 is the screen record for that. And then down here we've got set action hidden, and we're hiding all of these actions associated with the display array, right? These modification triggers for the display array. While we're playing with multiple row select, we don't want the user to be confused with all these other actions showing up out there, so we're hiding them. Let me just step through those two while we're talking about them. There we go. And then we're doing the same thing here for the second display array, the screen record for it. So we're hiding the insert, delete, append, and update actions for it as well. And then right down here, we're hiding the, we're showing the MRS action, and the reason we're showing it is because see the 1 here. So that enables or shows, well, it doesn't enable, it shows the MRS action again. Oops, I'm sorry. Nope, I'm backwards. Got it mixed up with the action, the other one. So this is set action hidden, and we are hiding the MRS action now that the user has already selected it by setting it to 1. These are kind of like a double negative, so they're hard for me to kind of read through sometimes. So sorry, bear with me here. So here we're hiding the MRS action by setting it to 1. And then here's set action active, move 1 and move 2, and we're passing that a 1. So that's going to make these actions enabled so that now the user can play with the multiple row select actions. So let's go ahead and step through those. And let's see here what we've got. Now let me get out of that function. Alright, so that puts us back in the dialog. And now the user, as you can see, we've hidden all of these actions here in the action panel except cancel. And we didn't hide the cancel option because we want to give the user some way to exit out of this multiple row select. But now all he can see is these options to do multiple row select. Let me click this so we can play with that a bit. There we go. So now I can go in and select multiple rows. Notice there's my dotted line. You can see it better, I think, here. See the dotted line? So right now this pink row is also the current row because it's got the dotted line. So I'm going to hold the Shift key down and select several rows. And now I can click on this redirectional arrow and move those over to the right. So notice when I clicked on that right arrow, it says on action move one. That's the right arrow up here at the top. That's the name of the action, is move one. It's calling a function called move selected, passing it a reference to the current dialog that we're in, which is this one over here, passing it SR1, which again is our screen record for that first display array, SR2, which is the list we're passing it to, the screen record for the second display array, and then A and B are our two arrays that we have defined, A being the first array and B being the second array. So if we step in there, we've got our move selected. We're assigning these variables, and then we just have a for loop here to do this appending to the second list and deleting the rows from the original list. We've already walked through this for loop a few minutes ago. So this is the function that we looked at earlier that goes through the process of finding the selected row using this isRowSelected method. And then if the row is selected, then we're going to append that to the second list and eventually delete it from the first list. All right, so our second chapter today is on styles, presentation styles. So by the end of this module, you'll be able to define and use presentation styles, add special effects to an object depending on its state or position, which is something new. Even if you've had the Genero Language Basics course, in that course we don't talk about being able to use what you could think of as conditional styles. So we'll talk about that for the first time here. We'll talk about specific styles for some of these special widgets, like table containers have a special style that can be applied to them that creates a picture flow, which is an interesting kind of animated effect for images. Define a text edit widget with integrated search, spell checking, and rich text. There's a lot of special style attributes for text edit widgets. Apply a style to buttons and labels to enable an HTML syntax recognition, and apply a style to a window to change the appearance of the status bar. So here's a discussion on presentation styles. You're probably already aware presentation styles centralize attributes related to the appearance of user interface elements. So very similar in behavior to action defaults that we talked about earlier in this class. Action defaults let us centralize attributes related to actions. Presentation styles let us centralize attributes related to lots of types of user interface elements, windows, form elements, menus, and so on. So it's common to use style attributes to do things like define font properties, background colors. We've seen some examples of that already in some of these samples that we're looking at. So you can apply a style to an object to change the look and feel of that object. For example, maybe I'd like a different font or a different background color, for edit fields. So these are all attributes that you can control by applying a style. Now previously we've talked about the idea of these resource files, and if you remember from talking about action defaults earlier this week, remember there was a special resource file that ended with a .4ad suffix that we could use to create an action defaults file. There's a global action defaults file called default.4ad, and it has kind of global defaults defined in it, and we can use those global defaults unless we're looking for something more specific. And then at that point we can create our own default.4ad action defaults file and customize the appearance of our action views. Well, we can do the very same thing here with styles, so it behaves in a very similar way. We've got this idea of a global styles file called default.4st that's in fgl.dir.lib. And again, if we want to override that default global styles file, we can create our own styles file and put it in our program directory or load it with one of these special class methods, and that replaces the global default. So there's a couple of ways we can do that. But we always have the ability to override those global defaults by creating our own styles file and then specifying that file instead of the default. So the behavior here for action default, decoration, and presentation styles for a lot of other types of form elements and their decoration is very similar. The techniques we use is very similar with the special resource files and the way those resource files behave. So here we've got styles applied to objects, just to give you some examples of some styles in action here. You're familiar by now with this idea of an action panel over here on the right-hand side of most of our forms that we get by default. So this particular window has had a style applied so that that action panel doesn't show up. So it doesn't show here. So that's just a simple style that we can apply. And that's a window element style. You've also see some special styles just for tables here. We've got some table rows here. It looks like even rows, and it's got all the even rows. The background color is set to blue for those. So that's a special style for tables. And then here's another style for tables where they've set all of the, well, this one column, essentially the background color, to green for this table. So there's a couple of styles that are applied to tables. So green background for the first column or this number column, but not for the second column. So you can see that a lot of these styles dramatically changes the look and feel of, for example, these table objects. We've talked about these resource files a few times now. The presentation styles file, like the action defaults resource file, is XML. So here's an example of a presentation styles file, and you can see the XML. Again, we don't normally feel like it's a good idea to go out and edit the default, the global styles file, the default.4st. Instead, we make our own copy of that file. We can call it default.4st if we like, and put it in our program directory, and it'll pick it up instead of that global default that's in fgl.dir.lib. So here they've created a styles file. They've named it mystyles.4st, and they could use the special ui.Interface class method to load this styles file when the program's executed, so that all of the styles in it then can be applied to objects in the user interface. So it looks like all the styles we're looking at here are Windows styles. And just to kind of review some of this, even if you were in the Language Basics class, it's good to review these quickly. We've got this style name equal window is a global style that can be applied to all windows and will be applied to all windows unless we override that style by specifically selecting one of these other styles by name. So our global style here for Windows is just normal window. It only has one attribute in it in this example, and the window type attribute is set to normal. Normal versus perhaps modal, right? Notice the second window style that's been defined is called window.Dialog. Window, of course, is the element associated with the style, so this style can only be applied to window objects, this dialog style. It too only has one attribute, window type, defined as modal. So this is more of a won't say a pop-up window, for example, but modal windows are always shown on top of other windows. It's used a lot for OK or cancel prompts for the user, so I think of them as kind of like a pop-up style window. But anyway, they come up on top of other windows. That's what a modal window is. Here's another style, the naked style, that can only be applied to a window object, right? We've got window.naked, and it has several attributes. It's got the window type attribute. This is a modal style window, so it's going to appear on top of other windows. It's sizable, so in other words, the user can size the window or change the size of the window. This border value is tool. The action panel position, that just means it's a small header for that border. Action panel position, this value is set to none. So a minute ago we saw where the action panel had been hidden on the window in the slide, the previous slide, and that's the attribute that they used to do that, to hide that action panel. So there's no action panel with this window.naked style. And ring menu position, again, is also, there is not one, right? It's hidden. There's no ring menu position. Then we've got window.main. Window type attribute here is set to normal. It's a normal window versus, for example, a modal window. And start menu position, value equal menu. So later, tomorrow in this course, we'll talk about start menus, and we'll come back to this particular style, this window.main style, because that's really what this is intended for, is to be used as a start window. So more on that later tomorrow. And then we've got this one that someone has come in and created called new style for window objects. And the window type, again, is normal. And for some reason they've decided that the ring menu position should be at the bottom. Now just a reminder, if you're looking through some of these styles that we're seeing in these examples, or you're trying to figure out what styles are available to you or what kind of attributes are available to you and what they do for various kinds of objects like text edit widgets or windows or edit fields, you can see all of that in the documentation. So don't forget that there's a lot of different style attributes out there for all these different types of user interface objects. So what I usually do when I'm getting ready to work with something is just check the documentation. I think this one right here is what I'm usually looking for, style attributes reference. And if you click on that, you can see that they've got this nice reference out here in the documentation for all these different types of elements. These common style elements are presentation attributes that can apply to any element in the user interface, windows, layout containers, form items, and so on. The rest of them are specific to a particular type of object, like a button or a button edit. Edit style attributes, that's our most common type of form item, is an edit widget. Labels, we've been talking about windows, so again, if we were over here so I can see, curious about the attributes available to me for Windows, I can go down here and click on that, and I can see all these different attributes for window objects, attributes for window styles, and then what those attributes do. And also you can see which front end that these attributes can be applied to, that are pertained to. GDC is typically the most yeses for that, but then you can also see for these other types of clients whether or not a particular attribute is available or not. So it depends on what kind of front end and what client you're working with as to which of these attributes you can apply or that will have any effect. So just a reminder, all of these different types of styles, attributes, are all documented in the presentation styles in the documentation. Whoops, went too far. So defining a style that can be defined at several levels. We saw a minute ago, we saw a window global style that just had the word window out there, right? There was no window dot style name. So that meant that the window style was just a global style that can be applied to all windows. And that will be the style for all windows unless you override it by naming a style specifically for that object. If you have an asterisk like this, you name your style that way, that means you're creating a style that's global to all elements, not just windows, right, but any type of user interface element. So that is truly global. If you just specify window or label or edit, then that's global in the sense that it can be applied automatically to all windows or all edit widgets automatically, but only to that specific type of element. If you use the dot and then the name of a style without the element type in front of it, that means that any element type can have that specific style applied to it. But it won't inherit it automatically. You actually have to apply the style by name before it will use that style, before it will use the attributes defined by that style. And then element type and then the name. It's what we typically do when we create most styles is we'll put, for example, window, dot, and then the name of our window style that we want to apply to our windows. So that's probably the most common method of defining a style. So here's our presentation styles file. Again, we're looking at another example, and we can also kind of determine the priority. Grab my highlighter. By the naming conventions that we're using. So for example, this window style that's just a global style for all windows has a lower priority than window.required. If I apply the required style to my window with the attributes clause, for example, or I can also apply it in the form, at the form level as a form property. I can define the window style that way. And if I do that, then that has a higher priority than this global window style. But our default style for all windows is going to be this window style. That's kind of our global default. And then down here we've got a special global default for labels that apply to all labels unless I have another style for labels, label dot such and such, and I apply that style specifically to a label. So this is our global default for labels. And then text edit widgets. I can apply different attributes to a text edit widget. So here's a style called int search that has the attributes needed to use integrated search with a text edit widget. That's just the ability to do the Control F to do the find that you may be familiar with. And so to be able to use that with a text edit widget, we need the integrated search attribute set to yes. And that's really the only thing we have to have. This wrap policy here is optional. They're just specifying that they want to break words at word, or break lines at word boundaries with this wrap policy attribute. But to use the Control F, the default for Control F, to do a find or a search, we have to have this integrated search attribute set to yes. We'll take a look at that in more detail later in the chapter. See some examples. And here's a style called .urgent. It has no type of element as the prefix. It's just got the dot and the name of the style itself. So that's a style that can be applied to any type of element that supports these attributes, background color and font size. So any type of element, edit widgets, labels, and so on. Anything that supports background color and font size attributes. So here we're looking at something I think of as conditional styles. They're called pseudo-selectors. That's the official name for these. But the idea here is we can apply an effect or an attribute to an object in the user interface depending on its state or position. For example, when an object has the focus is one of the pseudo-selectors we can pick from, then essentially we can apply a special effect to it only if it has the focus. So that's a pseudo-selector, a conditional style that is only applied in a specific condition, like if it has the focus, or if the object is in construct mode, we have a query pseudo-selector. And not only are these pseudo-selectors conditional styles, they're also defining the priority of our styles. So the priority for these is literally top to bottom. So this would be priority 1 is if an object has the focus, whatever attributes I'm applying with that style has a priority over any other style attributes that could also be applied. So if I have two different styles that could be applied to an object, let's say one that is a specific style like edit.urgent, right? Maybe it has a red background or something like that. And one is generic, like edit. Then it might use the more generic style if I've got a pseudo-selector set that has a higher priority. So it actually determines which style to apply based on the state or position. So here's a pseudo-selector that is only applied, the attributes are only applied if the object's in a display array. And earlier we saw some screenshots or a screenshot of objects for even rows in a table, right? So we had a table object and the even rows seems like they had a blue background. And we had the same type of thing for an individual column in the table. So you can do all of that based on state or position. So here's some examples of pseudo-selectors and what they look like when you configure them. You just create these in the styles file just like you would a regular style, the difference being that we use the colon for them. So here is a pseudo-selector for edit widgets, right? Edit objects only. And when an edit object has the focus, then we're going to use this style attribute, this background image is going to be this specific image, hereami.jpg. So when an edit widget has the focus, we want to apply this special background image. Here's another one for tables, table objects. We're using the odd pseudo-selector. And here we're saying that all the odd rows of a table, we're going to apply this light blue background color. Even rows of a table here, we're going to apply a light gray background color. So you can see that these special attributes then are only applied in the event of even rows of the table or odd rows of the table. So conditional styles. And here's one that's just for any object, any type of object that's active. So any active object is going to have a background color of white. So that would apply to anything that's active in the user interface. Anything active that supports a background color anyway. Let's see, let me think. That's probably good. So different ways to apply a presentation style. We've talked about several different ways to apply presentation styles already. Like for Windows, for example, we could use the attributes clause to apply a style. So open window, Then we have the attributes clause where we can name the window style that we want to use. We can use that same method with messages and error statements as well. Form element attributes. So in other words, you can set the style in the form specification file. Let's pop that up real quick, and you can see you can actually do that a couple of different places. Get rid of this, hide all this so we can see. So here at the form level, wanted to point out, I've mentioned it before, but I don't think I've shown it to you. If I highlight the form in the structure view, I can actually specify the style for my window here in the form. So that's one way to specify. Instead of using the code, the attributes clause in the code to do it, I can do it right here at the form level. And here's a style we have for the form. So the form itself is just called style. And in window style, of course, is the style for the window that form is opened in. So I just wanted to show you that. And in just about everything, if you click on an item in the user interface like a table, you're going to find a style property or style attribute here where you can specify the style for that type of object. So here's a table. I can specify the style for the table here. And if you click on that field and click on the ellipsis, it'll show you all of the styles available in your styles file that it's currently using. So right now it looks like there's only one style available in my styles file, my .4st resource file for tables, and it's this special picture flow style that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Let's take a look at Windows. I should have showed you that for Windows, but it didn't occur to me. So for Windows, so if I click on the window style property and click on the ellipsis, it shows me all these different styles in our styles file for Windows. So that's a way I can select my window style here, just by clicking on the checkbox and clicking OK. So different ways to apply presentation styles. So we've seen a few. We've got the attributes clause, then we've also can specify it in the form specification style. We also have methods, built-in class methods that we can use, set element style or set field style, that we can use to dynamically set or change the style while the application's running. So our styles are applied when an object is built, but we also have these special methods that we can use to change the style on the fly. So here we're seeing different methods. This is applying a style using the attributes clause for a window. Attribute style equal required. So in our presentation styles file, there must be a special style just for window objects called required that it's applying. I can apply a style in a form file. If I apply the style up here at the layout level, this is a higher level in the form, then essentially I'm saying that I want to use this style for all the elements, the subsequent elements in this form file. But I can also set it at a lower level, at the attributes level, and if I specify a style at the attributes level, it's going to override a style set anywhere else. So remember that style set at this level for an individual button or individual edit element is always going to override a style set at a higher level, like the layout level, for example, or the global default that you might be using. So very high level if I set it at the attributes, the highest level. So here we've got the style being defined in Form Designer. We saw this just a minute ago. So here's a table element in our form, and here in the properties we can specify the style and select it from a list. If there's multiple styles defined, I can click on that ellipsis and it'll show me all the styles, and I click the checkbox of the style that I want to use. So here's a specific style example. We saw this a minute ago when we clicked on our style ellipsis in our style property for a table a few minutes ago. It had this picture flow style that we could select. Well, this is telling us what a picture flow style is doing. So I've created a style, I've named it picture flow, and it has one attribute, and that special attribute is this table type, and here the value is picture flow. So essentially what we're doing there is filling a program array with images or paths to images, is the case here, and we just display that program array using our standard display array instruction. So there's nothing special about the way we're working with the array or the display array. It's just simply this style, this special table type attribute defined as picture flow. So I've actually got that here so you can take a look. There it is down here at the bottom. So this is what it looks like. Just gives us kind of an animated transition for these images that we're displaying. If we look to see how that was, better get the right form up there, hadn't I? If we look at the table container for that form, here's the style that's been selected for it, picture flow. And again, it's nice because it goes out and actually looks in our style file when we click on that ellipsis and pulls all the available styles for table containers. So that's what we're seeing here that we can pick from. So that's how it was defined in the form. The rest of this code is just standard code that we would use to display an array. So here we're defining an array, using a for each to load the array, and then displaying the array to our screen record. So nothing very exciting about that. Just typical display array. Notice we did use a special style for the window though, right? This, when we opened our window, we used this style called naked. If we look at the naked style, essentially there's no action panel, no ring menu defined. So just to show you that again, right? So no menu panel, nothing there except essentially this viewing area in the window. Pop that open so you can see the style. There it is, window.naked. So this is a modal window. The border's defined as tool, which is, we looked up in the documentation, it would just say it used a small header for the window. And here's our action panel position set to none, ring menu position set to none. There's no toolbar position or status bar type. So basically just an empty window that we're using for viewing this list of images. So that's the only other special thing we've done there, is define this naked style for our window and applied that. So we have just a bare window to view those images with. But the actual code is not complex. Now one other thing to know about this particular example is these images are not actually stored in the database. So we are looking at a database table in this code. So we're using a for each loop to fetch things from the product table. Oops, I clicked on that and I shouldn't have. The product table, and load those into the array. But what we're actually getting from this product table is not the actual JPEG or image itself. It's just a path. Right, this, like for example, art/ammonite-fossil.jpg. That is literally what we're loading into this array, is just this text or this string of information, not an actual image itself. So that's a fairly common thing to do with databases, is not to actually store these large image or binary pieces of information. A lot of times we'll just simply store the path and then actually store the images themselves out on disk somewhere where we have a lot of disk space. So this FGL image path environment variable makes that possible, and we use that to figure out where to search for these images out there on the disk. So this path that we actually have in the database may not be a full path, a complete path. It may just be a partial path, and we use this FGL image path environment variable to specify exactly where to go to find these images so that they can be displayed. So there's what I've used here, this FGL image path. My paths are buried deep beneath my C drive, so it's able to find those images to be able to display them. Now here's what we just looked at, I believe. This is showing the table, the special table style that we've applied. So we've highlighted our table object in the structure view of the form, and then right down here we can see that the style property for that has been set to this picture flow style that has that special attribute that we just looked at for picture flow. In a .per, of course, you set it slightly differently. Right? You have to do it here in the text, style equal picture flow. So here we're looking at, there's a BDL demo directory out there in FGLDir that has a lot of different demo applications. So one of the things I did was just pull this up out of that demo directory so that you could see some of the demonstrations they have that show you all the possible settings or properties for widgets, and then some of the special styles that can be applied as well. So I have that here too. Let me just pop that up so I can show it to you. I believe that's this text edit widget. So I didn't write this application or create this form. I just pulled it out of the demos that come with your Genero installation. So here it's got all these different areas in the form so that you can see what these different attributes and properties look like. Here's a text edit widget that doesn't have any special attributes set. They've typed in some data, and this is what it looks like with no special settings, this one up here at the top. Then for this next area of the form, they have a text edit widget defined with these special properties configured. And this is how it looks different. Special settings, color equal blue, stretch equal both. So we have the scroll bar here so that we can move up and down and stretch. Upshift so that we can see uppercase, although I'm not seeing it there. We'll look at that here in a minute. And then here we've got special settings here for stretch. We can stretch on the x-axis. Scroll bars are horizontal scroll bars instead of vertical scroll bars. Over here on the next text edit widget we have defined, we've got stretch equal y, so we can only stretch on the y-axis. And then we have scroll bars equal vertical again, so you can see the scroll bars over here on the right that go up and down. Get rid of this for a second. There we go. And then here's a show edit toolbox. That's a special style attribute. Most of these are just properties that you can define for a text edit widget, but the show edit toolbox and text format are actual style attributes just for text edit widgets. The show edit toolbox is to give you this special rich text editor that you see, where you can specify highlight characters and specify bold or italics, different justifications and indentation and that sort of thing. And this text format equal HTML means that if you've got HTML tags in your text edit widget, then you should render them as HTML and not just plain text. So there's a demo example that you can use yourself. It comes with the software, and there's many demos out there for all these different widgets to give you an idea what attributes and properties are available for them and what it looks like when you use them. Let's see, I was trying to remember what I was going to show you. Oh, okay, so for example, this one here, they've got a text edit widget here in the form, so I've highlighted that. And just to show you that these are properties that you can define for a text edit widget. Want tabs? There we go. So here's the want tabs is selected. Want no return characters is selected. Stretch equal both. Right here we've got the stretch equal both. Color equal blue. It's here somewhere. There it is. Color equal blue. And upshift. Okay, so it's case. That's kind of hard to spot. Case, and then it's set to uppercase. So anything there when it displays should be in uppercase. All right, and then let me go down to this one. Here's another text edit widget that they've added to the form. And these are style attributes that we're talking about here. So we're going to go up to our style property. And here's our different styles. And HTML toolbox equal yes. And that gives us the ability to use this special attribute show edit toolbox is set to yes. That's what gives us that special editor, those editor options that we saw at the top of the text edit widget viewing area. We've also got some other special style attributes defined here, special styles with spell check attribute defined, plain text is defined, so we could have also selected those styles instead. So more on that here in just a moment. We have a slide on that. So here we're looking at a text edit with that integrated search that we just talked about. So this is an application called Categories, and here's a text edit widget field that has some text typed into it. Allows you to display and enter multiple lines of character data. And then this one doesn't have the special rich text editor. We don't have that defined in this style, but we do have this special integrated search attribute defined. So that means that if we use the Control F, that's our default accelerator for that, we should be able to see the find option. So let's give that a try here. Get rid of that so I don't get my don't get confused on everything. So that would be this one, category styles. Let's go ahead and execute it and then we'll take a look at it. So if we query and we have some text there, we say modify, do a Control F, then it should bring up this search functionality. So here I can type in, how about clown, C-L-O-W-N. So there's our integrated search capability. And the next and previous, excuse me, I had to sneeze. So we can do our previous and our next there as well. If we had an additional clown, it would find that. Okay, so that's integrated search. Just this one special attribute, integrated search value equal yes. Maybe I should go ahead and show you the style for that here. So this is our style file that we're using for class here for all of our demos. And right up here we have a special style called search spell, it looks like. So we're using style search spell, which has a special integrated search attribute set to yes. We're also going to look at it here in just a second because we're going to talk about spell checking on the next slide. Let me just follow through on that. So there's our widget. And here's our style that we're using. So right here we've got this HTML toolbox set to yes. We've got the search spell selected, which gives us this integrated search capability. That's what allowed us to do the Control F and get that find interface. Okay, so now let's look at the next one. Text edit with spell checking. Okay, text edit with spell checking. Now for spell checking, it's a bit tricky because you have to have dictionary files downloaded and available for the GDC. Now this is only available for the Genero desktop client. If you're using a web client, it's going to use the spell checker built into the browser. So we don't need the spell checking for the web client, but we do need it for the GDC. So when you start working with spell checker, if you decide to use it, one of the things I would do is check the current documentation. For text edit style attributes, and look at the spell check attribute information just to get the latest information. So notice it says it's available for GDC and also for Genero Mobile for iOS. Those are the only two clients that it's available for. And it says with GDC, the possible values are the two dictionary files needed for each language. So you need one .aff file and one .dic file. And it even has a link where you can go and download them. And notice it's openoffice.org. Those are the only ones that we support right now, the only dictionary files, and only 2.x. Notice it says the files for OpenOffice org 3.x are not supported yet. So that's something that you can see would change with time. So when you start working with spell checker, always check the documentation first so that you know what dictionary files you need and how to point to those dictionary files wherever you have installed them on your system. So notice it says specify in the style the two files for the spell check attribute using one of these file formats. So let me click on that. And it says file formats. You can do it this way and just specify the pipe symbol between the .aff file that's part of the dictionary files and the .dic. And if you use this method, that traditionally means that you've installed those dictionary files in the Genero desktop client installation directory. I'm pretty sure that is not supported, I guess, except maybe for backward compatibility, but you might check that with version 3.0 because I believe it's not supported with version 3.0, but you can use an absolute path, which is what I've done, and I've specified the full path with this format, slashes just as you see here, to point to the location where I have downloaded those two dictionary files. So you can use an absolute path. So if you give this a try, this first method, like you put the dictionary files in your GDC installation directory and you specify this format and it doesn't work, it's because it's no longer supported with version 3. So then you either use the absolute path like you see here, or you can use a web server path and again specify the path using this format, the HTTP format. One of those methods. So let me show you my example because this is the example we see here. Got an HTTP example, it looks like. I think I've got a different example here, but let's just double check. There we go. Yep, so the method I'm using here is the full path. File, all these slashes, DICS, ENUS, and telling specifically I've got a directory out there where I've downloaded these dictionary files. And I specify those paths right here with this spell check attribute in my style. So 2 examples. There's one, actually 3 examples. This is the one using where you've install these dictionary files in the GDC installation directory. The method I showed you a minute ago is using the explicit path, the full path, and here's an example using web server path. And here's the text edit with rich text editing, so that we have this nice menu of options here for editing, bold, italics, and so on. And there's a special attribute for that has to be applied. This text format has to be set to HTML, and then the Show Edit Toolbox attribute has to be set to yes. So there's actually two different attributes that are required for the rich text editing. So if we take a look at our example, click Modify, we've got all these nice options where we can use bold, italics, and so on, change the font, etc., etc. To be able to do all of that, minimize that. We've got our settings here for our style, this HTML toolbox style. So two attributes, text format, value equal HTML was one requirement, and then the Show Edit Toolbox was the other requirement. And then here in our form, we've got our text edit widget selected, and then over here if we click on our ellipses, we see our different styles that we have created in our styles file, and we've selected this HTML toolbox style that has the Show Edit Toolbox set to yes and the text format set to HTML. Notice you can combine styles. We've probably already seen a few examples of that as we've gone through here, but you can combine styles by just putting a space between them. That's our separator. So in a per file, the old text-based form files, it looks like this. Style equal, got your style names in quotes, and then a space between these two separate styles that have been defined. In Form Designer, it's very simple. You just select the styles that you want from the list, use the checkbox to select them, and it will define the styles as necessary. You don't have to worry about a space. It'll put the space in there automatically. Hyperlinks and widgets. Here we've already looked at the text edit widget over here on the right-hand side, so now we're looking at some of these other special styles for different types of objects. Here we've got label support on the left for mail to and href links. Right, so we can click on that contact us, and it uses whatever our default handler is, browser or me email, to pop up so that we can do email, send an email to that person. And of course here we've got a label that's set up with a link to www.4jace.com. So basically we just have some HTML embedded there, and it's rendering it as HTML. It's observing the HTML tags. And then over here we've got a special style for a button, style attribute for buttons that render a button as a link instead of a push button, so it looks different. So let's take a look at what that looks like and how it looks when you run it. So here's our Contact Us. If we click on that, of course it pops up, uses whatever our default handler is. Here's our lchildress@4jace.com that we've got set in our mail to. And then we've got this link, www.4jace.com, for the other label. And of course you can see it brings up the 4Jace website. And then finally, this button as a link over here. It's kind of an interesting one because when I clicked on it, the idea is that it exits out of the application. So anyway, when I click on that link, it's the same thing as clicking on this regular push button that is triggering an action that exits the application. So that one's kind of hard to show you because it exits the application. There we go. All right. Get rid of some of that. There we go. So there's my button as a link, and it works the same way. It just triggers an action just like a regular push button or any of the other typical types of action views we've talked about. Top menu items or toolbar icons or whatever type of action view I'm using. It works the same way. So if we wanted to look at those to see how they were defined, bring that up so you can see it. So if I click on this guy, this label, I can do that over here, or I can do it in my form structure view. I can see that I've got this special style applied called L_URL, and it's got this label text format equal HTML. That's an attribute that's required to be able to have those HTML tags rendered as HTML. And then down here in my text attribute, here's what we have in our text. So href tags. So it's rendering those correctly. Mail to lchildress@4jays.com, and in the text we see is contact us here. So fairly straightforward. It just says if you embed some HTML in here, that special style attribute is going to render it as HTML instead of plain text. So here we've got this other label. Take a look at it. And this is the one that had a link to our website. So again, the style will be the same style. Let's stretch that out so I can see it better. Style is this LURL style that we saw earlier that has the text format set to HTML. And then right down here in our text property, we just have our HTML that we want it to render. Visit us at, and then here's our href tag, and it's going to open that in a separate window, and it's going to show us www.4jays.com as our link. Let's see, and I can't remember if we saw this one already. This is the button as a link. So here's our text. This link also triggers the exit action. We don't have any HTML for that. But the style here is this link style. It's just style name equal link. And it's just a button. So a button as a link. Just that simple style. Style name or button type equal link. So here it is again. This is the definitions for those styles with their attributes in the presentation styles file. So here's the button as a link style definition. We just have the widget as button, or the type of element is a button. The name of the style is link, and it just has one attribute, button type, value equal link. And here's our label. That LURL style that we saw earlier for our two label examples only has the one attribute, the text format, and the value set to HTML for that. So that gave us the ability to embed some href tags in our text and have those rendered as HTML. Contact us in www.4jays.com. So one more set of style attributes to look at, and these are for Windows. Here we're talking about setting up a status bar for Windows so that we can control the way that comments, errors, and messages are displayed. So there's a whole bunch of different options for that. You've got none, where you don't have a status bar, so messages, errors, and comments are all displayed on their own line. You can use the default, so if you don't set it to anything, you're using the default, which is the same as this Panels 2 setting. So if you look at Panels 2 down here, Panels 2 is 2 panels. The first panel is for comments, and Panel 2 is for errors and messages. So errors and messages will be displayed in the same area. But you have many other options for that, so you can customize your status bar however you like. So here's what that looks like. The same example we've been looking at for some of these special style attributes we have for labels and text edit widgets and buttons. We have down here at the bottom, we have a status bar attribute defined. Status bar type, value equal panels 4. And if we look back at the previous slide, panels 4, 2 panels. The first panel is for messages. The second panel is for errors. And so this is what that looks like. So the first message here is end of list. So that's the message. That's in panel 1. And then go back is an error. And that was in the second panel. So you can see kind of what that looks like. So open window 1 with form category, attribute style equal SB panels 4 is how we configured that, so that then whenever we do have messages or errors, it uses the configuration for our status bar that we set here. All right. So that puts us at the end of our presentation styles chapter as well. Okay, so not too bad today. That was a little over 2 hours, but that includes our break. So really it was about 2 hours today, which isn't bad. But before I let you go, let's go over the lab and see what kind of excitement you have for your labs today. 1 second while I pull that up. All right. So once you finish the first lab, you've got Lab 2 to work on today. So I've got the first step here, organizing the project structure for Lab 2 exercises. You probably noticed that when I was demonstrating these applications, I've got a Day 1 group up here in my project, and today I have a Day 2 group. So that's what this first part of the lab is having you do, is create a new Day 2 group for all of the exercises for today. That way you don't have this big mess of applications out there all mixed in together. So it's just a way of organizing. So that's the first step, is just to get organized and create a new group for your Day 2 applications. And you're moving some stuff into it as well. So exercise 2 then, we're enabling multiple dialogues in our ui.Dialog application. So you're copying an application that you created for Day 1 to give you a head start on Day 2. And then you're going to modify that application to enable multiple dialogues. So one of the things I like about this lab is it gives you a pretty good introduction to working with Form Designer. This is a fairly complex form. It doesn't look complex, but there's a lot going on in this form. Let me pop it up here. And that's a good part of today's lab, is working with Form Designer to get your form to look like this form. So notice I'm using a layout here, a horizontal layout. That's what these orange bars with the redirectional arrows pointing outwards is telling us, that that's a horizontal layout. So you're going to learn how to do that. Pull this down. And I've got quite a few containers here, right? So the overall container, the parent container, is an HBox, so that our objects in the form, our child containers in our form, are going to be laid out from left to right instead of top to bottom. So that's why we see our lists side by side instead of one list under the other. So that's our H box. And then within our H box, we've got a grid container. Right, so this whole area here is a grid container. It's a child container. And then we've got two tables. We've got table 1, which is our table we're using to hold the first list for our first display array. And then we've got table 2 over here on the right-hand side, and that, of course, is to hold the list for our second display array. And then we've got a group here in the middle. And in that group, we've got a couple of these buttons defined. So I think that's a good exercise. If you haven't had a chance to work with Form Designer very much, this is a good exercise to go through to get more comfortable working with containers and placing child containers and widgets where you want them inside of these containers. So I think you can learn a lot just from doing that part of the lab. So that's Exercise 2, and a good part of Exercise 2, working with Form Designer to do that. So that's what all these first steps are for, A through E. And then doing a little housekeeping here, setting the title, just making things look pretty, look nice in our form. And then here in step 2, then we're actually working with our multiple dialogues. So we're interacting with it to use multiple dialogues. This is giving you the specifics on working with the multiple dialogues step by step. And if you get lost or confused about that, you can look back at the chapter, the module that we covered today, and I've always tried to make sure that we've got snippets of code in those examples that can help you with the labs. So take a look back at the module that we covered, and it will probably give you the answers if you get stumped on how to perform some of these steps. Exercise 3, allow users to select multiple rows in an application. So here we're creating yet another new application and copying the previous one to give us a head start, and then building on what we've already done to enable multiple row select. So here we're using some of those 3 new special methods that we've learned to work with multiple row selection. And we're enhancing our form yet again for multiple row select, adding these buttons and such. And in step 3, we're enhancing our application to add the multiple rows and add them to the opposite list. So it lets us move rows back and forth from one list to the other. So we use a for loop for that, and in that for loop we're going to check the is row selected flag, and if a row has been selected, we're going to move it over to the other list and append it to the list on the other side, and then delete the row from the list on the current list. And here's steps to hide the MRS action and subdialog actions. Remember, we walked through that a bit already when we were looking at some of these nifty ui.Dialog methods. We've taken a look at some of those to hide those. Disable. Remember how we saw that these actions, move 1 and move 2 actions, were disabled, so you're going to do that yourself so you can see how that works with these ui.Dialog methods for that. And then finally, exercise 4, enhancing with styles, creating your own styles file, going in and specifying some of these special style attributes that we've been talking about. And exercise 5 is rendering a picture flow. Remember the picture flow application that we were looking at that just has the nifty transitions while you're displaying. It's just a simple display array, but it has a different look and feel because it's using a transition, kind of an animated transition between images. Very simple to do, just a simple display array, but you're using a special style attribute to do that. And as we talked about before, what we actually have in the database for these images is not a real image. It's not the actual image file. It's just a path to help us locate the image outside of the database on disk. So you'll need to configure this FGL image path environment variable that we looked at earlier to point to these images on disk. And it steps you through it and how to do that. And it should end up looking just about like the one that we saw earlier, where you can click on the images and transition between them in that list. Whole different look and feel for a display array.